And now, church, please open your hearts and your ears to hear this message from Exodus chapter 17, verses 1 through 7. From the wilderness of Sin, the whole congregation of the Israelites journeyed by stages, as God commanded. They camped at Rephidim, but there was no water for the people to drink. The people quarreled with Moses and said, "Give us water to drink." Moses said to them, "Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you test our God?" But the people thirsted there for water, and the people complained against Moses and said, "Why did you bring us out of Egypt? To kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst?" So Moses cried out to Yahweh, "What shall I do with this people? They are almost ready to stone me." God said to Moses, "Go on ahead of the people and take some of the elders of Israel with you. Take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile and go. I will be standing there in front of you on the rock at Horeb. Strike the rock, and water will come out of it, so that the people may drink." Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel. He called the place Massah and Meribah, because the Israelites quarreled and tested God, Yahweh, saying, "Is God among us or not?"
This section of the book of Exodus is set in the time of crisis being endured by the people of Israel. And we here today are enduring a health crisis in our own time. The Israelites are making their way through the wilderness as they leave Egyptian slavery and move toward the Promised Land. But it's not a smooth journey. This is a community on a difficult move as they go from participation in a past act of redemption, that is the Exodus, to a future act of participation in a promised goal. As history unfolds, these wilderness chronicles are increasingly about a community that finds itself caught between promise and fulfillment. Wilderness is no longer simply a place, but for Israel, it is a state of mind with an uncertain future. Some of us here today understand that feeling of uncertainty. Fear is their constant companion, even though they have seen great signs from their God. A pillar of fire by night and a cloud of smoke by day, the parting of the Reed Sea so that they could escape the Pharaoh's army, manna and quail to satisfy their hunger. They have witnessed and felt the power and the presence of God moving with them. Yet today they want more, need more. But the existential question from the scripture is God present among us or not? It reminds the reader that the emancipated slaves faced a very real threat. The occasion for today's text is the third crisis for Israel on its wilderness journey. And if you want to read about the other two, they're in the two preceding chapters. Once again, the people complain about their suffering in this situation. There is no water for them to drink. A parallel for this story is presented in Numbers 20, where interestingly, it is Moses who is grumbling. In response to the crisis in today's text, God does not create water out of thin air, nor is the natural order disrupted in any way. Water does indeed run through some rock formations, and so it is a matter of finding the places where that water can be extracted. The actions of both God and Moses, a human being, enable the hidden potential to surface. God works in and through the natural world to provide water for the people. So one might speak of divine providence in the world of God's creation. God leads Moses to help that is already available in the world of nature and helps this human to unlock it. God has created the world in such a way that it has healing capacities in and through which God can work in positive ways on behalf of its creatures. They will be able to find the most elemental resources for life. And God gives the Holy Spirit so that they can locate or discern those healing and life-giving resources. The people file a complaint against Moses for his ineffectiveness. He cannot produce water. His first question is, "Why do you blame me?" Moses reprimands Israel. God alone can resolve this issue, and that will occur in and through the work of Moses. One might think that the text would emphasize God's life-giving ability. Instead, the text highlights two verbs that concern the action of the people: test and quarrel. Again, the existential question here: is God present among us or not? Israel as a whole exhibits a lack of faith. Given what God has done up to this point, the people of Israel should have known that God is to be trusted. Israel is often portrayed as stubborn and arrogant, and this text plays on that. In the wilderness, life is precarious for the people of Israel. God is a creator and has fashioned the world of nature in such a way that it has positive capabilities. Human beings need to be alert to the hidden potential resources within creation for resolving creational issues. We also need to be aware that sometimes God gives us divine help to locate those resources. In the midst of their troubles, the people voice their questions to Moses, and Moses responds with his own questions. "Why do you quarrel with me?" It is remarkable that the people's back and forth bickering with Moses is interpreted by Moses as a testing of God. What does it mean to test God? How can God be tested? Is there a difference between arguing with God, such as Job did, and testing as we see it here? Is this different from the testing that Jesus accuses the devil of doing? And I'll raise that existential question again. Is God present among us or not? These people faced a very real threat, as we do today. Moses hits the rock and releases the water as he was commanded. Such an act ought not be considered miraculous, as if the water were created out of nothing, although a lot of commentators will portray it that way. Rather, water flows naturally in and through rock formations, even if it is not always evident. This prophetic action would enable that reality to be discerned by actions relative to that rock formation. Compare this divine move to God's provision of manna that we see in the previous chapter. The wilderness itself is not a desolate place, but is filled with gifts from God that need to be discovered. The wilderness does become a challenge for those who live in it. But there is water coursing through its rock formations. There are resources for life provided by God in the midst of desolate places in the wilderness. Again, those resources need to be discovered. People who specialize in wilderness survival know all this. In response to their difficulties, the people voice their anger directly to Moses, as they have done before. This expression of anger by the people of Moses is such a nature that he describes it as testing of God. This suggests a certain understanding of the relationship between God and Moses. The way in which people treat Moses might be viewed as comparable to the way in which they treat God. At the same time, their speech is such that their talking to God can be open and questioning with respect to what God has done, even though it is sharply negative. The word used for people's talking to God in this way is quarrel. This is very similar to the word that's used for arguing in court. This is a remarkable image for this dimension of the God-people relationship. What is entailed in such a description of the relationship? God is not simply the one in control of what happens in the relationship. What people do and say counts with respect to the divine human interaction. I think it's okay to argue with God, and have many times, with no lightning bolts. But it is always with the understanding that God is ultimately in control. Moses rightly wonders if these people feel that way. Moses wonders what should be done with this people, not least because he feels threatened by their behaviors. He thinks they're about ready to stone him. One might wonder that if they see God and Moses as one, would they stone God? Is God present among us or not? That existential question. God responds to Moses feeling threatened. Moses is to take some of the elders as witnesses with him on a journey to Horeb and take along the staff with which he struck the Nile. Here, though, the staff brings water for the people to drink, unlike its effect in the plagues, when all the water in the Nile was made unfit to drink. God will be there for them throughout this tumultuous time. Moses is to strike the rock, and as a result, the rock will pour forth the water which the people may drink. And Moses did this in the presence of the community gathered around him. God's presence matters. In view of this quarreling experience, Moses called the place Massah and Meribah, names that use the Hebrew roots for test and quarrel, because the people quarreled with and tested God, asking, "Is Yahweh among us or not?" Moses has every right to be frustrated by his people, so he questions God as to what should be done with this people, not least because of the threat to his own life that he perceives. Is God present among us or not? God's actions of presence and provision supply the answer needed by a fearful community. Do we today see God's presence and provision around us? Perhaps when we pay attention to the character of Moses and God's response to the situation, the text has more to say to the leaders of communities of faith, both clergy and lay, than it does to the members of our communities. It may be tempting to disregard the cries of the parishioners as the whining of people who lack faith or are fighting sirens. It may be easy for us to pit ourselves as leaders against those whom we lead or who we feel are resistant to our leadership. Perhaps in this Lenten season, as we reflect on the human condition, we must ask ourselves, how can we demonstrate God's compassionate presence and provision to those who cry out from under the burden of real, sometimes extreme, hardships? In our own health crisis today, what options and resources has God prepared for us to use? It's a good time to practice discernment if we aren't already. And again, the existential question, is God present among us or not, reminds us that these emancipated slaves and us face a very real threat. What can we do to help those around us? Are there people we can call to check up on, or even to simply relieve a sense of isolation? Is there someone else who needs some of those supplies we overbought out of fear? My neighbors brought home 17 large packages of toilet paper. I can't imagine in the next few months they're going to use them all. Do we have skills or talents that might make a friend or neighbor survival more tolerable? There's a difference between fear and good judgment. God calls us to discern which is which and to use the hidden potential of healing and resources that are already placed in creation for us to use. Amen.